here from the Secret Mom Hacks podcast. It's June 14th, 2024, and you are listening to part 2 of my first ever bonus episode. If you missed part 1, stop right here, go back to June 7th on this podcast feed, and listen to Spotting Signs of a Narcissistic Husband, Emotional Abuse is Real crossover part 1. And then come right back here and pick up where you left off because we cover a lot of ground in part 1 and I share key details leading up to what's covered in part 2. If you've been listening to Secret Mom Hacks for a while, you may have caught episode 41 where I shared my experience going through divorce with a newborn. There's a lot more to that story, however, and given the betrayal trauma and emotional abuse I went through during my relationship with my ex-husband, Sarene Leeds, host of the Emotional Abuse is Real podcast, was kind enough to welcome me onto her show to share my story and hopefully inspire others who may be walking through a similar journey. This is part 2 of our conversation, and it is the most raw and vulnerable I've been publicly with my backstory. But as I mentioned last week, if this empowers just one person to do what's best for them in their situation, then it's worth me sharing. Make sure you check out the episode description and show notes for links to the Emotional Abuse is Real podcast and follow along wherever you listen to podcasts. Now, let's jump into part 2 of my conversation with Sarene.
Are you a small business owner struggling to nail down your brand voice? Have you hired copywriters only to discover they couldn't capture your messaging? If that sounds like you, then you need to download my free resource, Discover Your Brand Voice in 3 Easy Steps. Once you complete these simple steps, you will have a solid foundation for producing your business copy, whether you decide to write your own content or outsource it to a professional, like, say, me. As an added bonus, you'll be automatically subscribed to my email list where you can learn more about my writing services and receive weekly updates about my podcast, Emotional Abuse is Real. Head over to the link in the show notes to grab Discover Your Brand Voice in 3 Easy Steps today. Trigger warning. This podcast episode features discussions of emotional and narcissistic abuse, gaslighting, manipulation, adultery, and sexual-related crimes. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Emotional Abuse is Real. I'm your host, Sarene Leeds. I'm a professional writer and storyteller, and I'm so glad you're here. Today's episode is part 2 of my riveting conversation with Krista Dykes, host of the Secret Mom Hacks podcast. If you haven't listened to part 1 yet, I recommend you press pause on this episode and go check out part 1 first. I've left a direct link to that episode in the show notes. Otherwise, to paraphrase Krista herself and the great Betty Davis in All About Eve, fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy ride. As always, before we get into the episode, I have a few quick announcements. Please make sure you're following me on Instagram at Sarene Leeds Writes. That's SareneLeedsWrites. And that you're subscribed to this podcast on either Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Also, don't forget to support Emotional Abuse is Real by leaving a 5-star rating and by writing a review over on Apple Podcasts. I also wanted to let you know that I'm gearing up for another podcast series like the one dedicated to toxic workplaces. This time, my focus is on emotional abuse from toxic groups, specifically multi-level marketing companies, also known as MLMs, as well as health and wellness groups. If you're interested in sharing your experience for this series, please either DM me on Instagram, email me at hello@SareneLeedsWrites.com, or fill out my quick and simple application form. I've left links to my Instagram, email, the show's application form, and my free download, Discover Your Brand Voice in 3 Easy Steps, in the show notes. In last week's episode, Krista Dykes opened up about her toxic and abusive first marriage. At the end of part one, she mentions a phone call that, quote, shatters everything. As you'll learn from today's part of the conversation, the phone call was from a local detective who confirmed that Krista's first husband's suspicious, manipulative behavior extended into horrifying criminal activity. We discuss how Krista's first marriage finally fell apart and how she eventually found the true meaning of happiness in her second marriage. So, without further ado, here's part two of my conversation with Krista Dykes.
So now we're at January 2019. I get a call that shatters everything as I knew it.
Yeah.
A local detective calls and asks me if I knew that my husband was under criminal investigation.
Mm-hmm.
And her question hit me like a ton of bricks.
Sure.
Of course I didn't. I would never willingly associate with someone accused of criminal activity or put my daughter around them. And what is she calling about? What is she talking about? So she let me know that he was being investigated for solicitation of a minor
Mm.
and sexual exploitation of a minor via electronic means.
Okay.
And they were in the process of issuing a warrant for his arrest.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I knew this had to be true. This is not a joke. This is not testing, tap, tap. This is real.
Yeah.
And now the puzzle pieces of the peculiar behavior were starting to add up.
Yeah.
Because this is now the third time a third party
Mm-hmm.
had contacted me about his behavior. And of course, this time I was presented with the most alarming information.
This is
So
stuff
if
you cannot ignore something like that.
No, absolutely not. So a few days later, they issued a warrant for his arrest.
Okay.
He turned himself in. His mugshot ran in our local media.
Mm-hmm.
I immediately moved my daughter and I in with my parents, and I'm very fortunate. They had moved here a few years prior.
I am so happy you had that option.
I don't know what I would have done.
Exactly.
They took us in.
Yeah.
And all of this happened when my daughter, she was only 6 months old when this call came through. So his mom ended up bailing him out of jail because we certainly didn't have the money for it.
Mm-hmm.
And in the back of my mind, I knew this was the final straw and I needed to file for divorce. However, something in me wanted to attempt couples counseling. Again, I don't know if this is that new mom family preservation kicking in or whatever, but we ended up going to 4 or 5 sessions, I guess, which primarily consisted of me on the couch crying my eyes out, asking what's wrong with us and, why don't you love me? While he sat on the couch, emotionless, like a brick wall, literally saying nothing but like yes or no. He was not giving any answers. So I became this like part-time private eye, knowing more answers. I knew what that person had sent me on Facebook, and I knew now what this detective was telling me.
Yeah.
But I knew that there had to be more there right in front of me if I looked enough for it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting how when you start looking for things, you find them.
Yes, you do.
And in the little downtime I had between, pumping for my daughter at work and after hours, putting her to bed, I would scour through bank and credit card statements and phone records for the last 7 or 8 years. And before I knew it, I was collecting more puzzle pieces that I needed that would ultimately lead me to filing for divorce.
Yeah.
So
Good.
Some of those pieces of evidence include dozens of lengthy phone calls to various random numbers throughout the workday, including a 2-hour phone call to a girl. And I know her name, I know her number, I know her face. I don't know if she knew about me or that he had a family. because again, knowing what I know now, I know he used a different alias and different information as he was making these different contacts with people. But yeah, he had a 2-hour phone conversation with a girl in a different area about 2 hours away from where we live on my 30th birthday. There were local hotel charges on our credit card while I was out of town on a work trip. Those charges correlated, I was on a company trip handled by the company. I had no financial obligation towards that. While I was out of town, he was taking those opportunities to use our finances to carry on these affairs. And I also found phone calls showing his location in yet another different area nearby, which once again, that was while I was traveling on a work trip. And I distinctly remember, like, that was my first trip out of town when I found out I was pregnant. I had traveled right after we had found out that we were expecting. And I distinctly remember this phone call and him telling me his whereabouts, and he'd seen a movie. Oh, and he took so-and-so with him. And oh yeah, he saw this movie for the second time. Sure doesn't line up with where his phone call was coming from. So I also found visits multiple times a week, paid for visits to a local car detailing shop multiple times a week, meaning he was going there to vacuum out his car to remove any evidence of what may have happened in there. So lots of details were falling into place where I knew now, without a doubt, divorce was the only answer. This person was toxic and my marriage had run its course.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm just so proud of you for doing that painful research, because you had to know it was your life. It wasn't fair for you to be kept in the dark. And I'm so sorry that you had to go through that. But there have been a lot of people on this podcast, and there are people who I always make reference to. I can't say who they are, who they see the toxicity, the abuse is right there in front of them, and yet they find all these reasons to stay. And everyone is different, and I can't explain why or excuse why they stay. Everyone has their own reasons, but you did the best thing for you, and more importantly for your daughter. So, I mean, I don't need to tell you that, but I just wanted to make sure that I said it out loud.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. And well, so finding all that I found, it's one of those things where I kept finding even other little details that could lead me down some other paths with just to collect more information. And it got to the point where I don't need any more information. I'm already disgusted and sickened, and I have my answers now. There's such a vast, heap now of details of his betrayal and him committing adultery, and now this detective telling me he'd even taken it to the level that he did.
Yeah.
I don't need any more information, but I know I could have found more.
Sure. So how long did it take to finalize the divorce?
It was pretty quick.
That's good.
Interestingly enough, I filed on our wedding anniversary.
Oh,
I filed for divorce.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I even worked with my attorney. I was
poetic.
I was like, oh, we can give it another day or two. Yeah, if you could serve him on this day, that'd be great.
Yeah.
And so
I get
that was June, and the divorce was final the end of October.
That's great, because I know that that's not the case for a lot of couples. And you, like you said, you are very, very fortunate, because an episode that I always love to reference is I had family law attorneys who specialize in narcissistic abusers, and they just talk about how drawn out some of these divorces can be. So I'm so happy to hear that you were able to remove yourself and remove your daughter from such a toxic marriage. So, oh, and I did want to mention, because when, early on in the marriage, when it sounds like you were trying to have like a money date with your husband, which it's really interesting because I think that I find like the idea of a money date is a lot more common now, and it just goes to show that something was up from the very beginning, and it's a sign of a healthy marriage if you like sit down, you talk about your finances. It's not an easy conversation, it's not. And I'll just slip in a little plug here. If any listeners are interested, I do have an article about financial therapists, and I would be happy to send that along to anyone who might need, because these are very difficult conversations to have, but you have to do them. You have to have them.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's something so as you mentioned, we do have a happy
Yes.
ending here, or we'll
Yes.
just say things
Please.
haven't ended. It's a new life chapter.
Yes.
But that's something that my husband and I, so I got married,
Mhm.
we're almost at 2 years now. We got married almost 2 years ago.
Congratulations.
Thank
Oh, that's so
you.
wonderful. Yes.
But yeah, just within the last couple of months or so, we've really started talking. I mean, we've talked about money from the beginning,
Sure.
but really having those concerted, we call it a spending plan date.
Oh,
like,
I like
like
that.
a
Yeah.
couple of times a month, because it
Yeah.
really, unexpected things do pop up, but if you're having conversations and can plan for those, plan for the plan when those unplanned things come,
Yeah.
then it's a little more palatable and you can make some shifts and adjustments, and that's exciting. Your partner should be a partner with you in
Yes.
all the things, and especially financially.
Exactly. And I totally get that you didn't really know what to do at the outset, because a lot of us were raised, the man is the head of the household, and it didn't a lot of us didn't see our parents having like an equal partnership. And it's so, it's so fascinating to me, where I see in so many cases where people end up modeling unhealthy behaviors that they witnessed from their parents because they don't know anything else.
Right.
Yeah,
You only know what's handed to you unless you
exactly.
go seeking out other solutions and ideas. And in today's day and age,
Yeah.
I just, it, not speaking, because everybody's circumstances are different, but
Yes.
for me,
Mhm.
I want to be partnered
Absolutely.
equally in all of that with my partner.
Me too. Yeah, absolutely. Are you co-parenting at all with your ex-husband?
I am not co-parenting
Okay.
with my husband. He ultimately pled guilty to his charges,
That was
was
going to be my
sentenced to
next
8
question.
years in prison, ended up serving 2 years in the county jail, because all of this happened
During
right
COVID.
at the onset of the pandemic.
Yeah.
So he is on the lifetime sex offender registry,
Okay.
and he gets to see her a few times each month for a few hours,
Okay.
and I supervise all of those visits.
Okay. All right. Thank you for sharing that, because that was something that I was curious about, especially after you shared what he was ultimately convicted for. So, and and I know you've mentioned that your husband is a devoted stepfather to your daughter. So
He
I'm very
is.
happy to hear that. Wonderful.
Yes.
I know it's a really general question, but how are you, and how are your daughter, and how is your daughter doing now?
We're both doing well.
Yeah.
When all of this happened, of course, I was shattered,
Yeah.
as I shared in my story. It's just unbelievable.
Yeah.
And it's like the news just kept getting worse.
Mhm.
And I felt like my future had exploded and disappeared. I mean, there was a period of time where I felt like a zombie. I mean, I had to be aware and alert and on for my daughter, of course. But I felt like in so many instances, I was just kind of going through the motions of just surviving,
Sure, sure.
because everything as I knew it or was dreaming about, just disappeared
Yeah,
in
yeah.
all over the course of a phone call. And see, the thing is too, he and I had done premarital counseling, and
Mhm.
I'll never forget the pastor who led us through that. One of the things he said is if divorce is even an option in your mind,
Mm-hmm.
you need to re-examine whether or not you're going to move forward with this.
Hmm.
I went into our marriage, like I said, till death do us part.
Yeah.
And so I was going through my private eye work and scouring the phone records and bank statement, seeing all of these puzzling things come together. And I actually called that pastor and I
Hmm.
explained the situation. And I was just in such an emotional, confused state. It sounds so weird, but I kind of felt like I needed to ask his permission to file for divorce, or almost like his stamp of approval. And thankfully he was very supportive.
I'm so glad to hear that.
Yes, he was very supportive
I find
of
that
those.
so many people, no matter their religion, they feel that way. They need to have that
There's this
support of their
shame.
clergy person. Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Yes.
He he was very supportive,
Hmm.
thankfully, and
Good.
he pointed out exactly as you did a little bit ago that my ex-husband committed adultery. He violated
Yes.
our marriage covenant.
Yes.
These were not petty, trivial matters of, oh, he just drives me crazy. And so I felt like, okay, I wasn't going to be punished for leaving this abusive relationship. And then it's just as far as how my daughter's doing. She's doing
Yeah.
great.
Great.
She's now almost 6. She was too little to know all
Yeah.
that was happening
Yeah.
when I was experiencing all of these things. And if I were going through it now, that would be a very, very different story.
Yeah.
But yes, she's doing very well.
I'm so happy to hear that. It's interesting because I mean, I'm trying to imagine what it must have been like for you going through this pregnant, also trying to care for a newborn and an infant. But in one way, it was a blessing because she did not really experience any of this. So,
Exactly.
yeah.
Exactly. And so when he was incarcerated, he wasn't around.
Yeah.
So I certainly did not I I felt like this is you're doing. Where the crimes were committed were actually about 2 to 2.5 hours ish or so away from our area.
Hmm.
And so the county jail where he was, it was almost a 3-hour drive.
Mm.
And I was like, I'm absolutely not, like, I'm sickened. You violated I owe you nothing.
Right.
And I wouldn't even give it a second thought about like taking her to
Hmm.
go see him, or I had nothing else to say to him.
Yeah.
So there was a period of time where he was out of sight, out of mind, and I I would mention to him, so now fast forward a little bit. At this point, of course, I had started dating, and
Yeah.
my husband, my
Yeah.
now husband, came into our life when she was, I guess, around a year and a half ish old, a year and a half or so.
Hmm.
So, and as things got more serious, and we got engaged, then got married, she calls him daddy,
Hmm.
and my ex-husband is her father.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
so to her, that is the normal.
Yeah.
And at some point, this is going to be future therapy appointments for myself.
Yeah.
And likely her, we're probably going to have to do some family therapy at some point about just
Yeah.
the dynamics of all of this. And I mean, living in the world we live in now, lots of families look different,
Yes.
different from the traditional family I grew up in,
Sure.
and so there's going to be lots of conversations and therapy to be had, as she gets older and starts asking questions
Yeah.
about, well, why do I have a father and a daddy?
Right.
So
Sure, sure. But good on you for being cognizant of that now. So when the time does come to discuss it in a therapeutic situation, um, you're already mentally prepared. So, Krista, what have you learned from this experience? I know,
a
another broad
lot.
question, but it's a lot.
I've learned
Yeah,
a lot.
it's a lot.
Yes,
But please,
I've
listeners really want to hear your wisdom on this.
I've learned, and it was interesting, my mom actually pointed this out
Mm-hmm.
to me.
Mm-hmm.
She was like, honey, sometimes things have to fall apart in order for things to come together.
Yeah.
And as painful as that experience was, I would go through every inch of it
Mm-hmm.
a zillion times over again to have what I have now. I didn't know what I was missing out on. I didn't know the type of relationship that I could have. I didn't know all that was ahead of me. All I didn't know what I was destined for, I guess
Yeah.
you would say. And I just did not know what I was missing out on. And I'm so thankful for the journey that's led me to where I am. This the country song "God Bless the Broken Road" that led me straight to you, right?
Yeah. Oh.
It's such a beautiful song, but
Mm-hmm.
I truly would go through it all again to have what I have now and what we have. I've learned the importance of being upfront
Mm-hmm.
and honest about emotions and trauma and speaking what's on your mind. That's
Mm-hmm.
something that I really appreciate about my husband is he will out of the blue ask me, "Well, how you doing, honey? What are you thinking about right now?
That's wonderful.
What's what can I do for you today? Is there anything that I can what can I help you out with today?" And he is just everything I ever wanted in a partner and more. And so, yes, as painful as everything was, there's a silver lining.
Yeah. I'm
And
so happy to hear this.
I've learned it's okay to ask for help.
Mm-hmm.
So many of us who are very strong-headed and solution-oriented think we have all the answers, and it is okay to say, "You know what? I don't know it all. I don't have all the answers. I need some perspective. I need some help." Going to therapy doesn't mean you're weak. There are
Absolutely not.
great therapists out there. It's okay to interview therapists.
Yes.
I've learned that there's a gajillion. You can throw a
Yes.
rock and find 1,000 therapists.
Yes.
So read the bios, read the websites, call and ask a couple of questions to find the one that's right for you.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, I just want to reiterate that because I've gone through a couple of, I don't want to call them dud therapists, but the polite term is they weren't the right fit for me. So, but the right ones are out there for you. And like you said, interview them. And I know for a fact because I've had therapists say this to me, they want you to interview them. What would you say to those people currently in emotional and or narcissistic abuse relationships who feel like they're stuck and they're hoping maybe they can try to get out? What should be their first step?
Well, I would tell them it's okay to feel like you don't have all the answers. You
Mm-hmm.
probably don't.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Narcissists and emotional abusers thrive on deception.
Yeah.
Focus on putting one foot in front of the other day by day, week by week, to take small steps towards the truth.
Okay.
And you are worthy. You are worthy of the truth. Narcissists will use gaslighting to make you think you're the crazy one.
Yes, they will.
For example, when my ex-husband handed me his phone telling me, "Here, look through it all.
Yeah.
Look,
Yeah.
it's all on here." I only looked through the texts, the emails, the phone numbers. Unbeknownst to me, I later found out he actually had an app on his phone
Mm-hmm.
that looked like a calculator or some other type of inconspicuous app, but it was actually a cover for
Mm-hmm.
where those private photos and videos were hidden. And I learned about that when
Yeah.
the anonymous person who had originally contacted me through Facebook,
Right.
she eventually came forward and revealed her identity to me. We had a phone conversation, which was very enlightening.
Wow.
But
Okay.
she told me that he liked to video them doing certain activities
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
telling me that he hid them in an app on his phone. But that's a perfect example
Yeah.
of gaslighting. Oh, here it is. It's right in front of me, and I just didn't even know where to look.
Right.
But
Even the
I am a
stories he was telling you. She
yes.
was, wow. Yeah.
Yes. But I'm a firm believer that the truth always comes out.
Yes.
The truth always comes out.
Yes, it does.
And the truth will set you free.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And the first person you have to be honest with is yourself.
Yes.
And to trust your gut, knowing that if something doesn't feel right, it probably isn't. If your feelings and emotions are being dismissed or minimized, those are telltale signs for concerns in any relationship, romantic,
Absolutely.
just friend to friend, coworker to whatever. If somebody is minimizing, that's because there's more to the story or something they're concerned about that they don't want to put you on the trail of, I've found.
Yeah. So thank you for getting so deep and dark with me. I want us to end on a much lighter note. I would love to hear more about the forms of self care and healing that have helped you move through this experience. I know you've talked about um, a lot of these things on your own podcast, but I'm always up for a good chat about bath bombs and baths and exercise and therapy. All the good stuff. Yes.
Yes,
Yes.
absolutely. Well, as I mentioned, the divorce was final October of 2019. He pled guilty to his charges March of 2020.
What
So
a
this was
time
just
to be alive, my
right. Right. So clearly this was just, around the time our entire world was shutting down, and
Yeah.
I felt like my world was falling apart in so many ways. Because of all of that and spending so much time inside, there were days I would just work from the back porch, or I would do work calls while taking a quick walk around the neighborhood. And this was around the time I bought a fitness tracker because I felt like, okay, I need to do something to, let's just set some small step goals, because I was also starting to put on some weight, buying bigger stretchy pants, and just not feeling great in my body.
Yep.
And I also started experiencing some symptoms that ultimately led me to be diagnosed with an anxiety disorder and vestibular migraines. So the doctors really urged me to find some ways to get in some more physical activity and establish some healthy self-care practices, both of which would help to alleviate these symptoms. So this is when I decided to go beyond just step tracking, and I actually started running. And this is also the point where I would maybe take a bath 2 to 3 times a week once my daughter went to bed, using yummy smelling bath bombs. I love the Lush bath bombs.
Me
They're
too.
so good. They're
Oh
so
my God.
good. I love their seasonal ones
Yes.
and the
Lush,
sparkly
I'm
ones.
open
Yes.
to a sponsorship.
Amen,
Yes.
sister.
Yes.
We will
Please.
be your biggest advocates.
We will. Bath bombs, your bubble bars, and also my daughter loves your products
I
too.
love it. Yes,
Yeah.
my daughter does too.
Yeah.
She thinks she loves it. She's like, "Ooh, I'm taking a mommy bath. This is what mommy puts in her bath."
I love it.
So sweet.
I love it. Yes.
But they just smelled so good. And, I would maybe enjoy a glass of wine or a hot tea, and I would prop up the iPad like just outside of the bathtub and put it on whatever show I might be into at the time. And I don't do the baths as much as I used to, but I do try to get in like maybe one weekly or every other week. Certainly after, if I do a really long run, I try to do a bath just to soothe the muscles. But as far as the forms of healing that got me through this, in addition to self-care, therapy, as we said, hugely beneficial.
Yeah.
I started seeing a therapist for several months after I had filed for divorce, and I stopped seeing her around the time my divorce was final. But I'm such a huge proponent of it. A solid support network, of course, is critical. I was fortunate to find a great family lawyer who she was experienced and familiar with the local judges, which helps. And I also kept a very small circle of close friends and colleagues aware of updates to just avoid gossip, avoid hearsay. I
Yeah.
was more about quality over quantity.
Yeah.
And I really don't know where I would be without my parents. I'm just so fortunate. They moved here a few years ago. I'm sorry, a few years after we had gotten married, actually, and just literally dropped everything to help me and help take care of my daughter when all of this happened. I never take that for granted. And I know I'm so lucky because that's not something others might have
Yeah.
the opportunity to have. So
That's wonderful. And yes, thank you so much to your parents. And also I commend you for keeping your friends and loved ones community small, because considering the circumstances of what had happened, that's not something that you just want like everyone to know about, especially when you're still processing it yourself. I think everything that you did was a great blueprint for anyone out there who may need it. And I just want to thank you so much today for your candor. And finally, Krista, how can people connect with you?
yes, people can connect with me over on my website, secretmomhacks.com. If you click the big button there, you can enter your email address, and I drop a weekly episode all about secret mom hacks and all the things nobody tells you about becoming a parent. So when you drop your email in there, you will get just the weekly update every time a new episode comes out. That's really the best way to stay in touch with me.
That sounds like a great idea, considering I've done that. And I think that you are correct in what you just said. So, Krista Dykes, thank you so much for sharing everything that you did today. You are a brave mom, you are a great mom, and you are a role model to all women out there. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Sarene.
Thank you for listening to part 2 of Krista Dykes' story on Emotional Abuse is Real. If you would like to connect with Krista, I've left the link to her podcast's website in the show notes. I also highly recommend you check out her podcast, Secret Mom Hacks, wherever you get your podcasts. Not only is it one of my favorite podcasts, Krista has such an infectious energy that it's impossible not to smile after listening to one of her episodes. But it's just an excellent resource for moms everywhere. Another reason I recommend checking out Secret Mom Hacks, because I'll be appearing as a guest in the coming weeks. If you would like to be a guest on my podcast, Emotional Abuse is Real, please don't hesitate to reach out via email at hello@sereneleadsrights.com, through Instagram at sereneleadsrights, or fill out my guest application form. Please note that this podcast should not be used as a substitute for professional mental health services. If you are a victim of emotional abuse and need help, please call or text the Suicide and Crisis Hotline at 988, or call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233. You can also text START, START, to 88788. Once again, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts. Follow me on Instagram and go grab my free download, Discover Your Brand Voice in 3 Easy Steps. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you next time.
Well, that's a wrap for my conversation with Sarene. If you found our talk valuable, make sure you subscribe or follow her show, Emotional Abuse is Real, wherever you listen to podcasts for more stories like mine. You can find links to learn more and connect with Sarene in today's show notes at secretmomhacks.com/bonus2. I hope you're walking away from our conversation knowing some of the telltale signs of gaslighting and toxicity in any relationship. Most importantly, I hope you feel empowered to trust your gut and be honest with yourself about what you're experiencing and ultimately what you want out of life. Life is short and you are worthy of love and happiness. Please follow me on your favorite podcast platform if you haven't already. Give me a 5-star rating and leave a review sharing your favorite takeaway so far. You can do all of that by going to ratethispodcast.com/secretmomhacks. Don't forget to stop by secretmomhacks.com where you can find transcripts, resources, and more. Make sure you enter your email address over there and subscribe for free so every episode is delivered straight to your inbox. Stay tuned for next week's episode, and until then, you've got this, mama.